have been working as one of the key factors in the body fluid balance or the body fluid and body volume regulation. So let's see how the system is working as a dynamic. Of course, if you start losing your blood, and therefore you can have a decrease of the meter pressure, you surely have a suppression of the baroreceptor stimulation. And this is irrespective of whether you're talking about high pressure or low pressure baroreceptors. If you just sit with the high pressure baroreceptors of the carotid sinus and the aortic arch, of course they will be deactivated. You know that these baroreceptors are the major input to the depressor center. But if the depressor center is concerned, you surely know that the depressor is going to be inhibited by the depressor. However, here we have a suppressed depressor response, so the depressor can happen the same and can initiate a sympathetic activity to be exerted. Of course, if you have less plasma volume, you have less blood going into the kidney. And if you have less plasma volume, there's a good chance that you produce less urine, so you have less sodium in the tubular fluid than before. Overall, any of these three guys would be enough alone to stimulate the renin-angiotensin system's activity, but of course, they usually simultaneously occur. So what do we have here? Whenever you see the renin-angiotensin system, as I mentioned, the number one thing that should hit your mind is that this is one of the strongest vasoconstrictor mechanisms that we have ever seen in our body. Therefore, it is going to increase the mean output pressure by a generalized total peripheral resistance increase. Of course, it is going to stimulate aldosterone production, so you have a suppressed plasma volume. Let's reuptake sodium and water as much as possible to normalize the plasma volume. And of course, you initiate the thirst mechanism to initiate a water intake, and therefore, to increase the plasma volume. So overall, what we have here is a very nice sequence of events, which have to be slow, however, because you have an immediate vasoconstriction, but in order to exert the sodium and water reabsorption and the thirst mechanism to be initiated, you need time. Eventually, you will get to the point of the plasma volume and the mean output pressure at least try to be normalized. You never know how far you can go. We are going to learn, the very last lecture of mine will be to talk about the cardiovascular shock, and you will see that hemorrhagic shock actually the consequences or the outcome depending on the amount of blood and the regulatory mechanism or the compensatory mechanism's activity. But here I think it's kind of nicely shown that whenever you change the plasma volume, you have other systems than just the vasoconstriction and vasodilation, like the renin-angiotensin system that tries to normalize the loss of the plasma volume and the loss of the mean output pressure by several targets. Now we have a parallel economic system which pretty much does exactly the same, but with different hormones, different mechanisms, and that is the ADH vasopressin system. You possibly have heard about the hypothalamus, which is our, let's say, ultimately neuroendocrine brain. Well, we have certain nuclei. In the small cell nuclei, you have certain hormones which are acting on the pituitary gland. These are the so-called releasing and inhibiting hormones. You are going to learn a lot. I think 8 or 9 different types in the next semester. You didn't forget. We have the large cell nuclei, however, which nuclei produce two hormones. One is oxytocin. We're not going to mention oxytocin now because it's not really regulating anything about the plasma volume regulation. But we have a guy called antidiuretic hormone, or the other name is vasopressin. Actually, if you know these two names of the hormone, this identical hormone having two names, you know the two major functions. Antidiuretic means you are working against diuresis, so working against urine formation. Vasopressin is putting some pressure on the vessels. Of course, it's going to be vasoconstriction. So let's see how these guys work. Same logic. Let's see how the ADH system is activated, and let's see how it acts when it's activated. The very first thing, which is immediately listed as a major activator, is a decrease of plasma volume. So the very same effect, the very same stimulus that we have seen in the case of the renin-angiotensin system. The second one is a bit different. I think you heard about the term osmolarity. Osmolarity is pretty much the concentration of osmotically active substances within the plasma. Now here, not the decrease, but the increase of the plasma osmolarity that is listed. Very simple question. When can you see these two changes at the same time? Suppression of plasma volume, but upregulation and increase of the plasma osmolarity. You see it very often when you are dehydrated. When you are sweating a lot and forget or improperly replenish the fluid that you have lost by sweating, you actually have this situation. And as I mentioned to you, that angiotensin II has, as we have previously discussed, has a hypothalamic action. And some of the book says, and I think now it's kind of proven, so you can pretty much forget about the question marks up here, but angiotensin II has some effects, at least part of it, exerted via the angiotensin, with the ADH system. And to show you that you can, of course, regulate the system, let me just tell you one more thing, that what is the major inhibitor of the ADH production? Of course it is alcohol. And your daily practice can prove that, because if you drink alcohol, eventually you are going to produce much more urine than the fluid that you took the alcohol in. Try once, drink half a liter of water, and you are going to urinate for 3 liters, at least, if not more. Half a liter is not really. So whenever you have these guys occurring individually, simultaneously, you have a good chance to activate the ADH. ADH system, per definition, as a mechanism of action, is very simple. ADH, vasopressin, has 2 receptors. You have the V1 and the V2. V1 or vasopressin 1 receptor was the original receptor that described in the arteries. This is a very strengthful vasoconstrictor agent, of course, immediately increasing the total peripheral resistance, because as a humerus circulating agent, it is going to increase DPR. The other one is the V2 receptor. This is rather the ADH receptor, the anti-diuresis receptor. It's found in the kidney almost exclusively, and when it's activated, the kidney, certain parts, collecting them, will induce the water reabsorption, of course, to decrease urine volume. So you are going to have vasoconstriction and water reabsorption at the same time. Plus, there will be one more effect, which is kind of identical to the action of angiotensin II. So how these dynamics look like using the same story, like we did in the case of the angiotensin system. You have a decrease in the plasma volume and or an increase of the osmolarity. So you have, let's say, acute dehydration. Acute dehydration immediately leads to decreased baroreceptor stimulation, which immediately activate hypothalamus. You don't need to know now this mechanism, but in the second semester, Professor Nanashi will introduce you such 3-4 steps by which a suppression of baroreceptor stimulation leads to hypothalamus stimulation directly. The plasma osmolarity, as I mentioned, will stimulate certain osmoreceptors as well, which also activate the hypothalamus. So any of these 2 guys would be enough. In the case of acute dehydration, you have the same. Not to mention that the decrease of plasma volume, as we mentioned before, activates angiotensin II. So angiotensin II can also stimulate the system, immediately combining the renin-angiotensin system and the ADH system to go for the same target, that is, to normalize plasma volume and normalize plasma osmolarity. First one is, identically to the effect of the angiotensin II, you do vasoconstriction. And the vasoconstriction results in increase of the TPR, so you try to normalize the mean arterial pressure that was suppressed by loss of plasma volume. You immediately increase water reabsorption, therefore you are trying to save your plasma volume. You lost your plasma volume, it would be so nice to normalize, so you decrease the urination. And the last one is thirst. As I mentioned, angiotensin II stimulates the thirst mechanism, ADH also stimulates the thirst mechanism, not to mention that angiotensin II stimulates ADH, which can stimulate together the thirst mechanism. So you increase the water intake, and again, increasing plasma volume. Here what you do is very simple. You normalize the plasma volume, and you normalize the plasma osmolarity. But from our perspective, it is much more important to say that this is also a long-term regulatory factor working for blood fluid balance and the mean arterial pressure regulation. Okay? What is the last one? The last mechanism is called ANF. Or the other name is ANP. Within the heart, within the atria, we have modified cells which are capable of endocrine functions, especially if the atrial wall has been stretched. So if you have the stretch of the atria by an increase in plasma volume, so here, let's say, a chronic increase of the venous return due to the increased plasma volume. Sometimes you have hypervolemia. Therefore, these atrial natriuretic factor or atrial natriuretic peptide is produced. Let's just try to translate the actual name. Atrial means producing the atria. Natriuretic, natrium is the name of sodium. And natriuretic means increasing the urine sodium content. So you are making sodium diuresis, if you wish. Like that. Okay? So the major function of this guy is to urinate sodium. How can the urination of sodium decrease plasma volume? Because if you have more plasma, what would be so good to get rid of it? Well, the sodium is an osmotically active substance. So if the sodium is retained within the urine, so you are kind of peeing the sodium, it is immediately withdrawing or keeping the water. Therefore, if you are urinating sodium, you automatically urinate water with the sodium, because it must be dissolved. So let's see whether you can do it or not. ANF is acting also on certain targets. The very first thing what it does is, in contrast to the renin-angiotensin system and to the action of the antidepressant, it is a vasodilatory agent. What it does, it usually dilates the kidney arterioles, and if you dilate the kidney arterioles, we agree that if you make local vasodilation, you change the flow. Here, you have more kidney blood flow. Although we don't know much of the details of the kidney regulation, I think for now it is more than enough that by increasing the kidney blood flow, you have a much better chance to produce more urine in general. Because everything that you create in the kidney, I mean urine-wise, is depending on the flow rate within the kidney. It also acts on aldosterone, however, in contrast to the action of the angiotensin II, it is suppressing it. So, upon the action of ANF, aldosterone is less produced, therefore the aldosterone is much less capable of stimulating sodium and water reabsorption. So, ANF not only promotes the formation of more urine, but it is not letting less sodium and water to be reabsorbed, again, to produce more urination. And the last thing is, and this is the triple action, or the last part of the triple action, it goes to the sodium transporters of certain regions of the kidney, and if you're unable to reabsorb the sodium, sodium will be retained within the tubular fluid, therefore it keeps water, and together will be diuretic, so urinated. So altogether these actions, kidney directly, kidney indirectly, because you have healed aldosterone, it's going for making more urine. And this is not a surprise, because what we want is to get rid of the plasma volume. So let's say we have hypervolemia, more circulating fluid than needed. Of course, this will act chronically as a chronic stretch factor on the wall of the atria. Therefore, more ANF will be produced. Very simple. Hypervolemia always results in ANF production. ANF is doing vasodilation. It's vasodilating in the kidney arterioles. You are producing more urine, therefore you increase the urine volume. You are inhibiting aldosterone. Aldosterone will do what? Aldosterone will increase the sodium and water reabsorption. Here, the sodium and water reabsorption will be less, so more urine is formed. Plus, you are inhibiting the sodium transport directly. Therefore, you are going to decrease sodium and water reabsorption, again increasing urine volume. Increasing plasma volume resulted in increasing, it's not working anymore. Anyhow, no, it's working. So increasing the plasma volume will immediately increase the urine volume to get rid of the plasma volume. So in summary, we have here a very, very sophisticated system. Whenever the plasma volume is increased, this is on the left side, whenever the plasma volume is decreased, therefore the mean arterial pressure is less than desired, you have the three mechanisms changing in the following manner. Decreasing plasma volume will stimulate the renin-angiotensin system, will stimulate the ADA system, but will suppress the ANF. If you have less volume, you have less stretch of the atria. Altogether, these changes will go for what? for increasing plasma volume and the mean arterial pressure. However, if you go everything backwards, what happens? If there is an increase in plasma volume, what happens to the activity of the renin-angiotensin system? Decreases. What happens to the activity of the ADH? Decreases. What happens to the activity of the ANF? Decreases. So you are getting rid of it. So these three guys are constantly working as homeostatic regulators of the fluid balance of your body. Therefore, they can be considered as long-term homeostatic regulating factors of your mean arterial pressure. They are not going to act immediately. They are acting for several hours, days, and weeks. But as homeostatic regulators, they constantly produce or keep on activity, which can be changed up or down regulation methods. Okay? Next topic is autoregulation. I don't know whether you have the notes. If you have it, just try to find it. We need to talk about the autoregulation before we get into the real regulation of the endothelium and structure. Because autoregulation is very, very special. The definition, the autoregulation is local. So you're regulating a certain artery or vein or whatever segment. Here we are going to talk about mostly arterial regulation. It could be humoral or myogenic. I know it's a new term of myogenic from the aspect of regulation, but I think it's understandable that this is somehow related to muscles. Please understand that this is myogenic regulation of the smooth muscle cells of the arterioles. Okay? And also it's short-term regulation, so you immediately see. I always prefer to say short-term and homeostatic, but before getting into that one, I think I need to talk about it. So what we do with autoregulation, let's say I'm talking about the coronary vessel. In the coronary vessel, we regulate its own flow. How? By local mechanisms. Of course, it is only in the coronaries. Sometimes they're humoral, sometimes in myogenic factors. You will see what are the differences. And of course, we need to talk about the short term. There's a need to change this one because it's not working. But I need. I might have another one. Okay, good. So, what are the two major types of autoregulation? I think it's much easier to understand the humoral because we have already talked about it. These are the humoral vasodilatory metabolites. You will see that by the production of vasodilatory metabolites, certain vasodilatory metabolites, you can perform the autoregulation of that particular segment. The other one is something else. It's called the Bayes effect. Did Professor Chan mention anything about the Bayes effect? Will it? Okay. Yeah, I think I still have time to cover it. Let's start with the Bayes effect. This is the phenomenon. I think it's a must to know it. Actually, for the secondary student, it is also a must. It's a very simple graph, if you wish. On the lower graph, you have here the arterial pressure, and here this is the flow rate. And if you recall of what Professor Chanuk has introduced at the very, very beginning, this graph looks a little bit, let's say, irregular. But it's said that above a so-called critical closing pressure, if you increase the arterial pressure, you have an increased flow rate. You remember the Hagen-Poiseuille's law. The greater the pressure gradient, the greater the flow rate. But this graph is somehow different. Look at it. You start, let's say, from 20 millimeter mercury of the arterial pressure, and then you go as the graph flow in physiology, so you increase the mean arterial pressure and you increase the flow rate. But then, within that range, what happens to the flow? Really nothing. A very, very minor elevation. There is always a little elevation, but you can say that roughly there is no change. How could it possibly? So within the autoregulatory range, despite of the fact that you have a change in the pressure, change in the actual driving force of the circulation, you can go from 80 to 120, there is not much of a change. What could be the actual answer for the question that why? The why question is answered by the above graph. Same x-axis, but this is the resistance. What's happening here? The resistance doesn't change below the starting point of the autoregulatory range. So you increase the pressure, you increase the flow, no change in the resistance. But look what's happening. In this range, if you go from 60 to 140, there is a monotonous gradual increase of the resistance. If you go from 140 back to 60, there is a monotonous decrease. So there is a linear relationship between the driving force, arterial pressure change, and the resistance. And if you know Ohm's law, you know that Q equals to P over R. If the P increases and the Q proportionally, the R proportionally increases, so if the numerator and the denominator proportionally change, then the ratio would stay constant. So here we have a very special phenomenon that within the range of autoregulation, the increase of the pressure does not change the flow, but it increases the resistance, which is kind of counteracting the knowledge what we have gained so far. But let us see why is it so important of this phenomenon. So what is the mechanism? The mechanism is the following. If you increase the mean arterial pressure, you obviously increase some kind of a stretching on the local segment. Again, let's talk about only an arterial. So let's take out the coronary vessel and put it into tissue culture bath and just measure that. Okay? So if you increase the mean arterial pressure, you increase stretch on the wall. I think this is so obvious that you are going to have more force acting on the wall. Within the wall, within the smooth muscle cells of the wall, so within the real sensors, we have so-called stretch-activated channels. Most of them are either calcium permeable cation channels or calcium permeable non-specific cation channels, whatever you want to call them, but one thing is for sure. They are conveying influx of positive charges, among which you have a good chance that calcium is also entering. And you know that if you have driving force of positive charges coming into an excitable cell, this is immediate depolarization, and if calcium comes into the muscle cell, you have a good chance that you have contraction. So here, that you have a depolarization and the increase of the intracellular oxygen concentration, which results in vasoconstriction. So the mean arterial pressure increase, or the pressure gradient that is increased within that segment, immediately results in increase of the resistance. And as I mentioned, if the R is increased, but it was induced by an elevation of the MAP, we know that the Q equals to pressure over resistance. If both the numerator and the denominator of the ratio proportionally increase, there is no change, a very minor change of the flow of the ratio to be seen. So here, the message is that despite of an increase of the driving force due to the proportional increase of the resistance, the flow minimally changes. This is when the student usually stops. But we need to get a little bit further. The whole idea of the autoregulator range should be working backwards as well. So what does it mean? Do you keep the flow despite of the fact that the pressure drops? Because this is one thing that, okay, I'm increasing my flow rate, I'm increasing my pressure, but I'm not increasing my flow. That would be good. Let's say the kidney is good. Why? Let's say my mean arterial pressure increases, but I am doing vasoconstriction, so I'm going to have the same flow rate, therefore I'm going to produce the same amount of urine. But what if I'm bleeding? What if my driving force, my mean arterial pressure goes from 120 down to 100 or 80? Can I still keep the flow, for example, in my coronary? Can I still keep the flow within a vital organ of my body whatsoever? It could be a skeletal muscle. Of course. So the mechanism backwards is also working because you always have some pressure. Therefore, you always have some stretching on the wall. So what happens if there is a decrease of the mean arterial pressure? Again, blood loss. There is a simple idea. Of course, you are going to have less stretch to the wall. Less stretch compared to the previous situation. So is it true, therefore, that less stretch-activated channels are activated than before? Of course. So there will be not depolarization and calcium in calcium elevation, but rather hyperpolarization compared to the previous states of the smooth muscle cells and the suppression of calcium. What happens to your smooth muscle cell if you hyperpolarize and suppress the intracellular calcium? Of course, it starts relaxing compared to the previous situation. And this relaxation results in what? suppression of the R. So if you're going from 120 down to 80, you are sliding down of this particular slope of the resistance. Therefore, you have an arm change Q as well. So is it good to keep the flow within the segment? Sometimes yes. It's good if there is an increase in outlet pressure. I don't want to overflow my organ with the blood. That's fine. Let's keep the same flow. Or there is a decrease of the perfusion pressure. I am losing my blood. No problem. I can still keep my desired flow rate. This is very important in the so-called vital organs. So the Bayes effect is the myogenic autoregulation is working upward and working backwards. Okay? But no matter what is the story, change in the driving force will not change the flow because you have a linear relationship between the driving force and the resistance. Now, what are the so-called humoral autoregulatory agents? Well, kind of surprisingly, these are the agents that we have learned together. These are produced, and we introduced this new term, use dependently. The more you use an organ, the more hypoxia, hypercapnia, acidosis, and adenosine that you produce. And this is so obvious what's happening now. Let's just talking about again, physical exercise. I am doing my workout. And during the workout, I'm producing here hypoxia, hypercapnia, acidosis, adenosine, several metabolites. They're always laboratory. So, the more I work, the more I produce from them. Therefore, the more blood I need, and they guarantee that I will get more blood since they are doing more and more vasodilation. But if I stop doing physical activity, what happens? I stop producing these guys, so compared to the physical activity state, their level is going down. So the vasodilation that they exerted is also decreasing. So the diameter of the blood vessels that had been vasodilated now goes back to the previous state. So use dependently, you guarantee that the more use of an organ, more production of these agents, more blood flow is there, but vice versa, less use of an organ, less production of these substances, less vasodilation, so getting a vasoconstriction is guaranteed, and this particular effect is going to be. Okay? So never forget that the Bayes effect is the myogenic autoregulation. We are going to learn several organs when we learn about the regional circulation, when we have seen these effects seen, and also we have use-dependent regulation. Sometimes you will see that these two mechanisms, they help one another, but sometimes they go against one another. Endothelium. We are going to finish today's lecture about just introducing the endothelium, because the endothelium has so large functions. One of the books said that endothelium is the largest organ. And if you think about it, it is true, because every single blood vessel is covered by endothelium. Okay. So, you got it? It's there. Endothelium. Endothelium has zillions of functions. It's so difficult to make any particular list. So I'm not going to do anything. I'm just like giving you some sparkles of knowledge. So the endothelium is working as one of your major, most important homeostatic organs because it performs several functions. Number one, of course, it is a barrier. It is actually a barrier between intravascular and extravascular space. And this is also a matrix of formation of the proper blood vessels, not only anatomically, but functionally as well. So what does it do? Of course, you have heard about these proteins, glycoproteins, like fibronectin, laminin, collagens, protein glycan, because I think in anatomy you got a lot of those lectures now. Endothelium not only is part of the extra intercellular matrix connection, but it is capable of producing these agents. So let's say there is an injury of the blood vessel, endothelium helps for the recovery of the proper extra intercellular matrix area, and also for having the extracellular matrix, which you see within the blood vessel. Number one. Number two. It is a highly metabolic organ. I think you heard about these lipoprotein, LDL, whatever this metabolism. Did you read already by chemistry the lipid metabolism? Of course you know that these guys not only have physiological but pathophysiological importance, because the LDL, the LDL enzyme receptors and the lipoprotein receptors, Maybe a key problematic factors, for example, atherosclerosis that usually starts in the endothelium. Lipid metabolism is a key in the endothelium. Of course, you know that endothelium is an immunocompetent organ. It performs immune functions, it participates in local and systemic inflammatory responses by producing interleukins, certain cytokines like leukotrienes. It is expressing major histocompatibility agents and antigens, so it's definitely an immunological organ. Possibly the less is known about the mitogenic function. I think you all know that whenever there is an organ evolution, you must produce new vessels. Without the endothelium and without the growth factors that are produced by the endothelium, I promise I'm not going to ask the abbreviation of these, but this is insulin-like growth factors, transforming-like growth factors, certain vascular endothelial growth factors. So what do? These agents are needed if you want to make neovascularization, formation of new vessels. Sometimes you don't want to do it when you get obese. Sometimes you absolutely don't want to do that when you, for example, grow a tumor, which of course requires new blood vessels. But for the organ evolution and regeneration, these are needed. Of course, guys, we're not going to talk about these one in details because this is way beyond the scope of my lectures. But I just wanted you to have a picture that this is a very blood vessel. We need to, however, talk about these two functions. A few words about the hemostatic function. I think you already had the blood lecture. Yes, you had. I just want to give 2 or 3 extra points to be put over there. And of course, we are going to participate. I'm going to talk about how the endothelium participates in the regulation of the vasculature. Okay, what about hemostasis? Hemostasis, per definition, is the control of the blood coagulation process. Under physiological conditions, you don't want the coagulation. So under physiological conditions, the endothelium must be involved in the anticoagulant functions because it must prevent the unwanted coagulation of the blood. How can you do that? Very simple question. The first one is, its surface, when it's inked at, is so-called non-wettable. The non-wettable means that it actually is not favoring the adhesion of thrombocytes, and therefore the initiation of the platelet phase of the coagulation cascade of the overall hemostatic process. It also produces prostacyclins, which are preventing also the aggregation, and it produces such kind of agents, I think you heard about antithrombin, heparin, plasmin gene activator, which are the typical molecules of the anticoagulation machinery of the overall hemostasis. So by its intact, healthy presence, and by their products, it prevents unwanted coagulation. However, what happens when there is an injury? In the case of an injury, the homeostatic goal is to stop the bleeding and therefore initiate coagulation, so to plug in the actual injury. In this case, it switches its function and it starts working as a procoagulant. What does it do? By exposing certain otherwise non-wettable molecules, now you have a wettable surface, which is very nicely favorable for the binding and the adhesion of the thrombocytes. Plus, it produces certain factors. Have you ever heard of thromboxane A, basic inspector and stimulator of the actual platelet aggregation? Have you ever heard about factors, coagulation factors 5 and 9 and 10? Of course. So not only the vascular phase is stimulated by them, but also the platelet phase and the coagulation phase. So it promotes all phases of coagulation once the injury had been occurred. Before that, it is an anti-inflammatory. Now, what does it do with the regulation of vascular tone? The role of the endothelium is to control local blood flow. So here again, we are talking about local blood flow events. We're not really talking about systemic effects of the endothelium. Of course it has, but we are rather controlling local function. How can we do that? Now, endothelium has receptors. Good question. What kind of receptors can be found on the surface of the endothelium? Well, let me say that endothelial cells are pretty much expressing all known receptors for all known agents. So how can we classify them? It's not possible to classify them. Therefore, the very artificial one is, let's talk about mechanoreceptors. Mechanoreceptors are stimulated by shear stresses or shear forces. This is nothing else but the force created by the moving blood. The circulating blood is creating a constant shear force on the very superficial of the endothelium. So this is the first line that actually is touched by the moving blood. And these shear forces, shear stresses, are sensed by, constantly sensed by mechanoreceptors. Of course, if you have an increased flow rate, increased velocity, these stresses will be stronger. If vice versa, then the stresses will be less. Plus, you have ligand receptors for literally everything. So if you inject to an endothelial surface certain agent, you have a good chance that the endothelium will respond. To a certain degree, of course, we are going to mention a few which are a bit of more interesting thing, but here I think the starting point would be that. Now, if the mechanoreceptors and all the ligand receptors are activated, the question is what happens? So what are the products? Here, in the case of the production, we have also two possibilities. One is that you might have vasoconstrictors. Actually, the endothelium also contains the angiotensin converting enzyme, so it produces angiotensin II, not only in the lung, you have it in several other tissues as well, in general, the endothelium. So you're producing angiotensin II, which is locally active. Thromboxane A2, endotheliums are one of the strongest endothelium-derived vasoconstrictor agents. So these guys can do vasoconstriction. Is it good for us? Of course, this is, for example, helping not only the overall regulation, vascular regulation, but also the vascular phase of blood clotting, I mean the hemostatic function, because the vascular phase is to do vasoconstriction. But do we have vasodilators as well? Of course we do have vasodilators as well, and one which we need to talk a bit more about nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a very, very important molecule. Actually, it was also recognized by a Nobel Prize. And the Nobel Prize was given for a very, very simple mechanism. And the mechanism is depicted here. Even before 1998, there was a description of so-called endothelium-derived vascular relaxing factor. So they recognized that under certain situations, when you stimulate the endothelium, there is something that's released. They didn't know at that time what was that something. Was surely released from the endothelium. And that one immediately resulted in the relaxation of the smooth muscle cell just underneath the endothelium. Of course, you know the different layers of the arteriole. This was called endothelium-derived relaxing factor. And they recognized that this factor can be initiated by either shear stress or certain ligands. Not all the ligands, certain ligands I'm going to mention. Actually, I have already mentioned 3 of them. We talked about them, acetylcholine, serotonin, and histamine, and these kind of guys, which could be initiated. And the mechanism is very simple. The endothelium is a fully functional cell type. It is capable, of course, of recognizing certain stimuli and increasing the intercellular calcium concentration. And these gentlemen, what they described was a very simple idea. They found the actual target molecule of the increase of calcium. And that was NOx, nitric oxide synthase. And the nitric oxide synthase is producing a very primitive chemical reaction. It grabs the neck of the L-arginine, which is pretty much everywhere since you are talking about an amino acid. And you are degrading it to citrulline, you can say the byproduct, and the gas. And here we're talking about the primary #1 signaling molecule that is working in a gaseous form, and it is controlling locally, very importantly here locally, the blood flow. How? Of course it is a gas, so it can penetrate like there are no barriers, and it penetrates the smooth muscle cell of the neighboring cell, and then just underneath the endothelium. And here it activates an enzyme. And you all know this enzyme because it's the brother of the adilylate cyclase, but that is the guanylate cyclase. And the guanylate cyclase is not producing from ATP cyclic AMP, but from GTP produces cyclic GMP. And the cyclic GMP has such a signaling pathway that we don't want to teach it here. It's like a 3-4 step pathway which immediately induces relaxation. So here what you do is you have your ligand not even touching the smooth muscle cell. You have your shear force not even touching the smooth muscle cell, of course, because the shear force touches what? The blood stream is touching, is like having physical contact, not with the smooth muscle cell, but with the endothelium, and still the smooth muscle cell will happen. And of course, after the function of these very nice gentlemen, huge companies like Pfizer came into picture. They found out the very nice benefit of this citric pathway. And what they had is, they invented Viagra. And Viagra has a very, very simple target. You know, cyclic GMP can be catabolized by phosphodiesterases. Cyclic AMP or cyclic GMP. Viagra doesn't do anything, but it inhibits phosphodiesterase. So it prolongs the cyclic GMP-mediated vasodilation. Well, and if you're lucky to have it in a good place at a good time, then it could be very helpful for certain literally actions. So here, the word is about the shear stresses and ligands acting on the endothelium can release nitric oxide, and the nitric oxide will do the job. Okay, please remember this mechanism. You are going to use several agents, both in cardiovascular and in cardiovascular practice later, which are targeting the nitrate, nitric oxide pathway, of course, in cardiovascular, for example, treatment of certain vasoconstrictive states of the coronary vessel, and so on. Before getting to the very end conclusion, let me just take some examples. So how does shear stress work? Of course, it's so difficult to say that how can shear stress pick only nitric oxides? Of course, not going to do that one. But we always say that shear forces create certain mixture of events, but when they increase their activity, the mixture will result into major pathways to be activated. One is that we surely increase nitric oxide, but we surely decrease endotheliums. In a physiological regulatory mechanism, normal physiological shear stress increase on a healthy endothelium always results in a certain imbalance. More nitric oxide will be produced in endotheliums. Endotheliums are vasoconstrictors. Nitric oxide is vasodilator. Therefore, overall, you have an imbalance which is again for vasodilation. So the shear stress effect is very simple. More vasodilator nitric oxide is released than endothelium one. And that is it. No more differences. Now what about acetylcholine? Do you remember when we talked about acetylcholine? We studied the following. Acetylcholine is a vasodilator with intact endothelium, but it's a vasoconstrictor without the presence of the endothelium. Why? Acetylcholine is acting as a humoral agent. It goes to the muscarinic receptor. Let me tell you that this is usually M3, but you don't need to know that one. However, due to the M3 receptor activation, we have nitric oxide release. So if endothelium is there, does acetylcholine bind to the smooth muscle cell? Not really, but it binds to the endothelial cell, and the nitric oxide will do the job. Nitric oxide will perform acetylcholine-induced endothelium-mediated vasodilation. Well, what if you remove endothelium? What if there is a damaged endothelium? What if there is an arteriosclerotic endothelium? Then acetylcholine now has a chance to bind where? The muscarinic receptor on the smooth muscle cell. And we learn together that muscarinic smooth muscle cell, muscarinic acetylcholine receptor in the smooth muscle cell can initiate contraction. But this one is no longer a vasodilation anymore than vasoconstriction. So healthy endothelium, acetylcholine vasodilating. Damaged or missing endothelium, acetylcholine is contracting vasoconstriction. And this is exactly the same thing for histamine. And this is exactly the same thing for serotonin. Serotonin has serotonin receptor. The name is 5-hydroxytryptamine, 5-HT receptor. You don't need to know it now. Pharmacology will guarantee that you know that. So serotonin binds to 5-HT receptor, which is also a calcium-natellate receptor. And when you stimulate the nitric oxide release and vasodilation, but if you remove the endothelium, the 5-HT receptor will guarantee to have what? We have vasoconstriction. Again, acetylcholine, histamine, serotonin, with intact endothelium, nitric oxide mediated vasodilation. Without endothelium, we have a leakage. Now what about the norepi? Norepi is a bit tricky. Let me tell you that the norepi is causing vasoconstriction, irrespective of whether you have or you don't have endothelin. And this is true even in the case that we know that norepinephrine is capable of releasing the ketoconazole. However, norepinephrine is usually not really coming from the circulation, but rather from the as neurotransmitter. So you do see a much stronger effect of norepinephrine there on the smooth muscles. And you know that norepinephrine preferential by the norepinephrine. As a general, the smooth muscle cells are mostly expressing alpha-1 adrenergic receptor. Therefore, irrespective again of the presence of the endothelin, norepinephrine is causing vasoconstriction. Okay, so that was the conclusion of the humoral and extra regulations. Please note the following. We need to start regional circulation. So the shock is going to be the last lecture. We are going to talk about regional circulation. We have 3 lectures of regional circulation, and the last lecture is going to be shock. Okay? Thanks.